This week we're going to delve further into the question of where our ignorance comes from. We'll examine how individuals, groups, institutions, and governments strategically create and manipulate ignorance. There's plenty of material there for the most avid conspiracy theorists among you. But we're also going to tap into the ways in which ignorance gets constructed inadvertently, as we individually and collectively go about our ordinary activities, exercise our preferences, and think our everyday thoughts. You may find that accidental ignorance is even more intriguing than purpose-built ignorance. For the first 3 lectures this week, starting with this one, I'm going to present material on the ways in which ignorance is deliberately created and maintained via political and social processes. The 4th and 5th lectures will explore ways in which ignorance is implicitly or inadvertently generated or maintained via culture, preferences, and social norms. The 6th final lecture will examine the question of whether ignorance can be thought of as a public problem, and if so, whether there are any solutions for it. In addition to withholding information, proliferating disinformation, and inhibiting curiosity, there's another way we can impose ignorance on others, and that's by undoing their knowledge and sowing doubt. We can convince people that what they thought they knew, they don't really know. We can create uncertainty or doubt where there wasn't any, or we can amplify existing doubts. The manufacture of doubt turns out to be a widely practiced stratagem, especially in politically charged topics. In order for seeding doubts to have the desired effect, it has to be acceptable to raise them in the first place. In some religious or political settings, for example, raising doubts about fundamental beliefs or values is regarded as heresy and therefore impermissible. In other settings, raising doubts is the norm. At first glance, social norms advocating this may seem scarce, but it's a matter of knowing where to look. Criminal trials in Western courts of law are one example. A defendant is to be convicted only if guilt can be demonstrated beyond a reasonable doubt. And so the primary job of the defense is to raise doubts about the defendant's guilt. Another example is in communities of scientists and scholars, where ideals of informed skepticism and critique can dominate, so that any offering of new knowledge must pass trials by fire of intense scrutiny and counter-argumentation by experts before it is published. These ideals and norms can, of course, be utilized for political ends. In his 1995 book, Cancer Wars, Robert Proctor documented the influences of professional, economic, and political interest groups on American governmental priorities and funding of cancer research. One of his primary findings was that the American government collaborated with private enterprise in generating doubt about the environmental and industrial causes of cancer. David Michaels' 2005 article in Scientific American and his 2008 book on the manufacture of doubt followed Proctor's lead. He identified 3 primary messages orchestrated by the tobacco industry to challenge the scientific consensus linking smoking with lung cancer. First, argue that cause-effect relationships have not been established. Second, claim that statistical analyses are inconclusive. Third, emphasize that more research is needed before laws or policies can be adequately justified. This industry hired its own scientists, founded its own research publication, Tobacco Health and Research, and carefully orchestrated a media campaign to spread their messages. More recently, Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway's 2010 book on similar themes appeared, updated to include accounts of how doubts were manufactured concerning climate change and global warming, in particular by organizations employing tactics inspired by the tobacco industry's example. Frederick Seitz, a former president of the National Academy of Sciences, was hired by the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company to direct their medical research committee. Seitz distributed $45 million in research grants to projects designed to promote tobacco, and therefore steering clear of anything that might impugn tobacco. In 1984, Seitz, Robert Jastrow, and William Nierenberg founded the George C. Marshall Institute, which then applied Tobacco Institute tactics of doubt-mongering to the issue of climate change. They claimed that global warming was caused by natural variations in solar flux, and that any warming caused by greenhouse emissions is swamped by natural climate variations. The Marshall Institute on its website claims even today that there is no certainty about the extent of human-caused climate change. Oreskes and Conway documented an elaborate political and economic network of climate denialist scientists with links to well-endowed think tanks such as the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, and the Competitive Enterprise Institute, and financial aid from trade associations such as the Electric Power Research Institute, the Global Climate Coalition, and the Tobacco Institute. I won't go into further details of doubt-inducing tactics here. The sources I've mentioned do an excellent job on this topic. Instead, I want to focus on an issue that supplements the material covered by those sources. Machiavellian scheming and normative skepticism are not the only producers of doubt. Doubt also can be an unintended byproduct of debate or balanced coverage of an issue. Journalists have been taken to task recently for giving equal time to global warming disbelievers on grounds that the scientific consensus is so strong that lending credibility to disbelievers does the public a disservice. Holly Stocking and Lisa Holstein's 2009 paper presented a case study of the media coverage of a controversy following the rapid growth of industrial hog production in North Carolina during the 1980s and 1990s. Their chief interest was journalists' responses to various attempts by the North Carolina Pork Council to discredit and discourage a University of North Carolina public health scientist's research regarding health and environmental problems arising from hog production. Stocking and Holstein related 4 kinds of journalists' professional orientations to the ways in which they treat conflicting views in scientific controversies. First, there's the journalist as disseminator, who is interested in ascertaining the facts and getting them to the public quickly. All viewpoints are to be presented impartially, regardless of any differences in credibility or status. It is up to the public to sift through the competing views and decide which are plausible and which not. Second, there's the journalist whose goal is investigating deeper interpretations behind the facts and providing useful context. This stance requires that the journalist make some independent judgments about what is credible or reasonable and what is not. Third, there is the populist mobilizer, giving voice to the public and influencing political agendas. Again, this orientation entails some independent judgments on the part of the journalist, especially concerning what the public needs to know. And fourth, there's the adversarial journalist, maintaining vigilance and skepticism of public officials and special interest groups. This role involves uncovering hidden interests served by public pronouncements or silences in scientific controversies. The disseminator and adversarial roles are the most likely to raise doubts, but they do so in different ways. The disseminator's pursuit of even-handedness can lend weight to views that in other forums would be completely discredited. The adversarial journalist, on the other hand, is more likely to raise moral doubts. For example, are the experts truly impartial about the evidence? Or do they have vested interests of their own? Perhaps the most interesting finding in the Stocking and Holstein article was that journalists with a high degree of scientific literacy were less likely to follow the equal coverage rule of thumb and more inclined to evaluate the various claims and counterclaims, in most cases coming out in support of the scientists. An implication is that the equal coverage rule also may function as a let-out for journalists who are ignorant about the science concerned. In their study of the American media, Max and Jules Boykoff found that more than half of all stories on global warming from 1988 through 2002 gave equal time to climate denialists, with another 35% giving them time while recognizing the consensus view. These journalists' uncertainties were then transmitted, wittingly or not, to their audiences. This lecture is focused on the manufacture of doubt as a way of undoing knowledge and thereby generating ignorance. We've seen examples of how this may be done deliberately and strategically, but also how it may be done inadvertently, even in the service of a laudable aim, such as balanced coverage of controversies by the news media. The next lecture will broaden the scope of this theme by examining other kinds of strategic ignorance.